I write because in some secret compartment in my brain, this little ironclad woman keeps screaming, "It's all you have." I write because it's art, and it's my first love before Russia. My truest passion. It swallows me, ego and all, in one enormous gulp. I don't write letters. I write disjointed chapters in my unending epic. The muse. She climbs into your body and moves your puppet limbs and eases the words loose from the walls of your soul. Rachel, as a college student, wrote about where we live in Washington State, and she said, "Studying the history of this area roots me. It makes me more conscious of the land and more conscious of myself and of the people around me as actors in history. Studying local history is motivating. We've certainly waded in the same water and wandered on the same beaches as very brave people. It makes bravery seem more possible, something that can occur on the forest roads around the Skokomish." She wrote of Perry Creek, which is a quiet stream that flows out of what's called the Black Hills near our house. And she said, "In the summer, the rushes grow so tall you can hide in them and be completely invisible. This is where I came from, tunnels through rushes. I could spend all the light hours of all the days in tunnels through rushes in the middle of the estuary at the mouth of Perry Creek. This is where I came from, and this is where I would have liked to stay, sunburned and hidden and close to water, making up whole pretend histories about shipwrecks and Swiss Family Robinson." But Rachel went to Rafah. Her response to 9/11 was to become very involved in the peace movement in Olympia, where we live. She was drawn to the issue of Palestine and Israel by people who lived in Olympia. One, an Israeli woman whose family members had survived the Holocaust, who grew up and lived in Israel for 29 years, served in the Israeli military, and then became a very outspoken voice against the Israeli occupation. Rachel was impacted by other people who had gone to Israel and Palestine in the 80s and 90s, and like many people, after being there, came back to the United States and couldn't forget, and continued their work as best they could here, addressing this issue. And she was also impacted by members of ISM, or the International Solidarity Movement, some of her friends from college who in the summer of 2002 traveled to the West Bank and Gaza to join with Palestinians in nonviolent direct active action resistance to the occupation. Rachel learned from all of these people. She expanded her own study of this conflict, and she began to study Arabic as well. And she wrote in her journal, "Why do I want to go? I've been organizing in Olympia for a little over a year on anti-war global justice issues, and at some point it started to feel like this work is missing a solid connection to the people who are most immediately impacted by U.S. foreign policy. I feel pretty isolated from the world in some ways because of living in Olympia my whole life. So I've had this underlying need to go to a place and meet people who are on the other end of the portion of my tax money that goes to fund the U.S. and other militaries." Rachel arranged her life to finance her own trip to Palestine, and in January 2003, frightened but very determined, she left our home in Olympia. She traveled to David Ben-Gurion Airport, went quickly to the West Bank for training with ISM, and then to Gaza. There are only two stipulations for joining ISM, this Palestinian-led resistance movement. One must believe in freedom for the Palestinian people based on the relevant United Nations resolutions and international law, and one must agree to use only nonviolent direct action methods of resistance. In the book Live from Palestine, Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, who is president of the Union of Palestinian Medical Relief Committees, wrote that during the Second Intifada, Palestinians were pleading for international protection at the beginning. But it was not UN troops, he wrote, in smart uniforms who took up positions in our villages and cities, nor was it US soldiers storming ashore as in Somalia. It was individuals who responded to our calls. These people came even at the risk of injury, arrest, and deportation to stand side by side with Palestinians against the Israeli military occupation. Whether they came to break the siege, protect children going to school, or pick olives, they have come. Rachel chose to go to Rafah because she believed that it was probably the most isolated, the most desolate part of the occupied territories. She recognized that there was danger. When she first called home on her telephone after arriving in Gaza, I will always remember her voice because I could hear the trembling as she asked us if Craig and I could hear the shelling that was coming from Israeli military equipment along the border outside the house in which she was staying. And where we were living at the time in North Carolina, by telephone, we could indeed hear that shelling. And then Rachel began to send her emails to us and began to open our eyes. Our family, I think like many in the United States, had no direct connection to this issue. Even though we had heard about it all our lives, it was that situation that would never get better, there would always be a problem, there would always be conflict, was kind of the way that we viewed it. And it was very much on the periphery for us. Rachel changed that. She wrote, "I don't know if many of the children here have ever existed without tank shell holes in their walls and towers of an occupying army surveying them constantly from the near horizons. I think, although I'm not entirely sure, that even the smallest of these children understand that life is not like this everywhere. An 8-year-old was shot and killed by an Israeli tank 2 days before I got here, and many of the children murmur his name to me, Ali, or point at the posters of him on the walls." Rachel wrote of the impending war with Iraq, which actually started just a few days after she was killed. She wrote, "I went to a rally a few days ago in Han Yunis in solidarity with the people of Iraq. Many analogies were made about the continuing suffering of the Palestinian people under Israeli occupation and the upcoming occupation of Iraq by the United States. Not the war itself, but the certain aftermath of the war. If people aren't already thinking about the consequences of this war for the people of the entire region, then I hope they will start. Love you, really miss you. I have bad nightmares about tanks and bulldozers outside our house, and you and me inside. Sometimes the adrenaline acts as an anesthetic for weeks, and then in the evening or at night it just hits me again, a little bit of the reality of the situation. I am really scared for the people here." Nadal's English gets better every day. He's the one who calls me my sister. He started teaching grandmother how to say, "Hello, how are you?" in English. You can always hear the tanks and bulldozers passing by, but all of these people are genuinely cheerful with each other and with me. Rachel told us that going to Gaza was one of the most important things that she had done with her life. With other activists, she spent nights sleeping at wells to try to protect them from demolition. She stood between Palestinian municipal water workers who were trying to repair the wells that had been damaged or destroyed, and the Israeli towers that were along the border from which shots would